Part the 5th. It's about time you got back. Just look at yourself, all covered with dirt, and I'm sorry I'm downwind of you. You smell like you've been standing in fresh mugwort. Phew! By the tone of his squawks, Cedric seemed delighted to see Graham again. The tunnel had delivered on its promise of escape, and had brought Graham out to a secret opening by the forest warning sign. Cedric's complaints were a joyful noise. I must admit you were right, Featherhead, Graham conceded. It was dangerous in there. I'm lucky to get out alive. But I found Alicia's heart, so let's go back and return it to her. Graham and Cedric did just that, giving the golden heart to the tree when they arrived there. The small heart pulsed once and filled the grove with white light. The glow condensed, rushing inward, and coalesced into the slight form of a pretty blonde woman holding a harp. In the process, the willow tree vanished. I'm a princess again, the girl shrieked. I'm a girl, I'm a girl, I'm a girl. Alicia slung the harp away from her in disgust. I don't even want to touch this thing again in my life, she exclaimed. All I want is some new clothes and to see my Herbert. Did I hear my name being mentioned? Alicia! Herbert! Oh, Herbert, where have you been? Where did you just come from? The answer was lost amidst their hugs and kisses, and hand in hand they disappeared into the bushes. Graham never did find out how the prince happened to show up at that moment. Isn't young love grand? Commented Cedric. They didn't even take the time to thank you. Graham picked up the discarded harp, examined its workmanship, and strummed a few melancholy chords. By this point, the king had become confused and as moody as the music he was playing. He and Cedric had traipsed east and west and north around Serenia, finding much and discovering little. What little they had learned of his family had come from Madame Mushka, and the king was fresh out of ideas. Over Cedric's objections, Graham started walking back to the gypsy camp in hopes that he might learn more from the fortune-teller. True, he had no coin to cross her palm with, but perhaps she would take something in its stead. Graham's disappointment was sharp then, and his mood darkened again when the two reached the cold gypsy campfire. The wagon with Madame Mushka was gone, and the clearing was deserted. Nothing remained of the former encampment other than the tracks of their wagons. As the king stared at the ground, desperate for inspiration, he noticed a glint among the high grass. A bit of rubbish, uncharacteristically left behind by the traveling folk, he assumed. When Graham went to pick it up, though, he found what he thought to be trash was really a tambourine. Perhaps it had fallen out of a wagon as it bumped over a stone. Graham took it, if only because his father would approve. Cedric hooted his annoyance. Look, King, it's time to stop moping about and do something constructive. Why don't we head back to Serenia Town and take our chances there? It's better than nothing. Suppose you're right, agreed Graham, without much enthusiasm. But let's go there by a way we haven't been. That way we may stumble on something interesting. Who knows, Hoot Owl? We just might get lucky. Or dead. Thank you for those words of encouragement, Cedric. Lead on, great monarch. Time flies when you're standing still. The roundabout route which King Graham and Cedric chose to take to Serenia Town meandered south to King Antony's castle, and then veered eastwards. This led back into the more settled parts of the country, so it was not surprising that they soon came upon a small house in the woods. It was built of fallen logs, most covered with moss, but looked to be watertight and cozy. In front of the place, a young gnome played merrily with a toy, a finely carved marionette. On a nearby stump sat a much older gnome smoking a pipe filled with some aromatic herb. The homey sight threatened to bring new tears to Graham's eyes, suggesting to him that if he were not successful in his quest, he might very well never know the joys of being a grandfather. Graham moved closer to the old gnome. As he did so, he began to notice that the gnome's features looked somewhat familiar. His brain, usually quite clear in such matters, was unable to put a name on the face. Good day, Sir Gnome. My name is Graham. You seem familiar. Have we met before? Don't seem to recall, kid. Can't say I do. What's your name? Perhaps I'd recognize it. It's much too difficult to pronounce. That's strange. I'm sure we've met, but my brain seems clouded over the details. Whatever. I've been admiring your son's toy. It's quite beautiful. Should be. Made it myself. He's my grandson, not my son. The gnome's replies were short and to the point. Well then, would it be possible for me to purchase the toy from you, or perhaps trade for it? Both the gnome and Cedric, who was sitting on a branch listening to the exchange, looked surprised. Not very likely. What would an adventurer like you want a marionette anyway? It's for my grandchildren. Cedric hooted for attention. You're not a grandfather, Graham! What are you talking about? I want to be. Graham paused a moment, then took the petite spinning wheel out of his pack and offered it to the gnome. Would you take this in trade? Graham asked. The gnome took a quick step backwards. Where did you get that? It's mine! From an old hag in the dark forest. She has no need for it anymore. The gnome reached out quickly and snatched the spinning wheel out of Graham's hand. Give it here! So that's what happened to it. I bet that dumb crow never understood that this wheel can spin straw into gold. Thanks for returning it to me. Sir, even though it is rightfully yours, would you consider giving me the marionette in return for it? Sure, kid, you're owed that. I can always make another one quick. Here, have a good journey. Bye! The old gnome gently took the toy away from his grandson, handed it to Graham, and led the boy inside. You didn't like that old toy anyway. Wait till you see what this spinning wheel can do. The door to the snug house closed tight behind them, leaving Graham and Cedric alone. A toy, King? You call this getting lucky? It's better than getting killed. You've got a good point there. The main road to town is just a little south of here. Let's be off. The path from the gnome's home took Graham and Cedric past the back of the Swarthy Hog Inn. The fine smells of cooked food still spiced the afternoon air, reminding Graham that he hadn't eaten yet that day. With no way to pay for a meal, it was a thought best forgotten. Next to the inn stood a tall haystack, tempting travelers rest for a few moments in its cushioned comfort. Graham told Cedric that he was going to laze a bit in the hay before they continued on. Cedric agreed that it was a good idea and found himself a comfortable perch on the inn signpost. As he waited, he cleaned and polished his monocle. The king leaned back against the hay with a contented sigh. He wished he could spend the moment, and a lot more like them, with Valanice. The thought of his wife resting beside him in the hay stiffened his resolve to not just rescue her and their children, but to thoroughly trounce both Mordak and Manannan. He leaned back deeper into the hay in his reverie. A sharp jab to his backside shattered the daydream. Ouch! What was that? He wondered, scratching the slight prick. Kneeling down, he began searching the haystack for whatever stung him. He knew better than to expect to find anything. May we be of assistance, King Graham? From behind him came a small, familiar voice. King Antony and an army of his subjects began streaming into the hay pile. A few minutes later, the monarch of the ants reappeared. Looking up at the kneeling Graham, Antony held forth a golden needle, which his followers had found in the haystack. We promised to help you if we could, King Graham. Please take this golden needle with you as a gift from us. Perhaps it will be of some use on your journey. I am sure this is what you sat on. Adieu! Leaving the needle for Graham, a long line of insects disappeared into a hole in the ground. Graham put the needle in his pack and voiced a thank you to the Ant King. He felt like he was talking to the dirt. Just what are you doing, talking to the dirt? Cedric asked, hovering in the air in front of Graham. Graham looked up, smiled at the bird, and said nothing. He began walking towards Serenia town, knowing that his silence was paying back the owl for 2 days of jibes. He strolled and whistled while Cedric sputtered. As the two were passing the bakehouse, still engaging in their friendly spat, Graham heard a loud shrieking from behind him. Turning quickly, lest he were being attacked, Graham saw merely a slim rat being pursued by a snarling, ragged-eared cat. Normally, such an encounter would receive little heed from Graham, or from anyone for that matter, But the king was not feeling particularly sympathetic toward felines just then, especially cats with live suppers in mind. The first thing that came to hand was the old boot he had found in the desert. Taking quick aim, Graham threw the tattered leather at the cat. It smacked into the road right in front of the cat's face, bounced off its nose, and rolled into the river. The cat veered off sharply at the sudden attack and sprinted for safety. "Get!" Graham shouted after it. "Go pick on something your own size! Get!" As the cat's dust settled, the intended victim snuffled up to the king's feet. "Thank you for saving my life, kind sir, and that of my babies too, for they would have no one to feed them if that cat had fed on me. Perhaps I can repay you sometime." Talking bees, talking ants, talking trees, and now a talking rat. That white snake is powerful stuff, Graham thought, as the mother rat disappeared down the road. "Talking to the animals again, King?" Cedric inquired. "Was that what you were doing by the haystack?" Once again, Graham just smiled and hummed a tune. He walked into Serenia Town, happily leaving the owl's question unanswered. Despite the fact that Graham had no coin in his possession when he entered the town that day, by the time he left it, he was almost ready to take on the great mountains. Only a few shops were still open, and the streets had not many people about them. The broken wagon from the day before remained in the same place, blocking an alley, but its owner was nowhere to be seen. Near the broken wheel, not far from the fish barrel in fact, a small silver coin lay lost among the cobblestones. Graham watched it for a bit. It didn't move, which was to be expected, and no one came to claim it, which wasn't. "One problem solved," muttered Graham as he took the coin. "It's not much, but it should buy us something." The king looked up and down the streets for some time, deciding where to go first. He picked the tailor shop where, between the fabric, bolts, silken shirts, and paeans to the quality of the shop's goods, Graham found a warm, fur-lined cloak. Such a garment would be a necessity in the high mountains. It fit Graham perfectly, but cost much more than one silver coin. Taking a cue from his meeting with the gnome, Graham suggested that the tailor might be interested in trading the cloak for the golden needle that had stuck him. The needle had the same effect on the tailor as the spinning wheel had on the old gnome. It belonged to him, the tailor told Graham, but he had lost it or had it stolen. In either case, the needle had disappeared in the vicinity of the inn. Graham had no choice but to return the golden needle to the tailor. However, the man was so grateful to the king that he gave Graham the cloak he had been seeking. When the king left the shop, both men were satisfied with the outcome. The next stop was Serenia's shoe shop. There the king found that the old couple who ran the establishment had nothing at all to sell. Graham had hoped to trade the elven boots, which were much too small for him, for something that might be more useful. Finding nothing, he listened to the poor proprietor's tale of woe, and how they were penniless, with nothing to eat. King Graham's heart is such that he will always attempt to aid those in need, even at his own expense. "I don't know if these would help, but perhaps you could sell these fine elven shoes for some profit." "Take them." The shoemaker and his wife were stunned. "We cannot," they cried. "These boots are so valuable that we could sell them for enough to close this shop and live in comfort for the rest of our lives." "They are yours," insisted Graham. "I have offered them to you, and they are of no use to me, and I have no time to spare to try and sell them." He handed the boots to the man, who took and caressed them. "Look at the workmanship! Look, the buckles are solid gold! Mama, we're rich!" The couple embraced in their happiness. As Graham made to leave, however, the shoemaker handed the king his cobbler's hammer. "Perhaps this will be of some use to you in your journey, noble sir. Take it with you. Today we stop making shoes, and I'll need it no longer." Graham followed them out the door, hammer in hand. The only other shop open that day was Serenia's toy shop. While an unlikely place for the king to enter, he had noticed a snow sled hanging on one wall. Such a sled could be very valuable in the mountain snow and ice. This transaction became both the easiest and the hardest for Graham. The sled, of course, cost more coin than the king had. Graham didn't want to part with the marionette, but it was all he had to offer in payment for the sled. Anyway, he said to himself, if I don't rescue my family, I'll never have grandchildren. The price is steep, but necessary. That decided, the deal was made, although the toy maker kept insisting that he was getting the better of Graham. And with that third transaction, King Graham left Serenia town and went looking for food. Cedric was waiting for Graham as he left the town and listened with little approval to the king's telling of what he had acquired. Those things may be well and good use for you, king, but I have no use for a cloak, nor a sled, nor hands to hold a hammer, and no need for a silver coin to buy my supper. Tree grubs and small rodents are perfectly fine and free, thank you. But for you, king, that coin will buy what is considered the best pie in all of Serenia. You will need food on this trip, you know. I know, and my stomach knows even better, Graham agreed. Wait here. This shouldn't take long. The reason it didn't take long was twofold. Graham's silver coin was just enough to buy one pie. It was custard, his favorite, although when it comes to pie, all kinds can be considered Graham's favorite. And it was the only kind of pie they had left to sell at that time of day. Secondly, Graham knew that if he stayed very long in the bake shop, he would be tempted to just start eating. He was hungry, true, and custard pie does not travel well, but he wanted the pie for eating in the mountains, preferably as dessert. If he didn't leave the bake shop quickly, he would have neither coin nor pie. He would have a very satisfied sweet tooth, however. Graham did not linger at all. Despite his preference for pies, Graham knew that more substantial food would be needed to sustain him in the mountains. Having had great success with bartering that day, he wandered down the road to the Swarthy Hog to attempt trading for some meats and vegetables to carry with him. The tailor had mentioned to the king that the owner and clientele of the place were much less savory than their food, but Graham had no qualms about entering the place. After all, it was a public alehouse. There are alehouses, and there are alehouses. Graham recalls the Swarthy Hog as having an unremarkable decor and remarkably nasty patrons. He entered the inn and at once began inquiring about provisions. That's when he lost consciousness, whacked on the head by some heavy weapon. Had he not been wearing his adventurer's hat, he is sure he might have died from the blow. When Graham awoke, he was in the cellar of the inn, bound tightly to a chair, and no matter how he struggled, he was unable to free himself. This was his situation for several minutes, when he received aid from a quite unexpected source. The scrabbling of sharp claws on the stone floor alerted the king that he was sharing his makeshift prison with some sort of rodent. He was, only it was no common vermin, but the slim rat whom he had saved earlier that day. Graham didn't know this at once. Of course, all he knew was that the rat was climbing all over him. Then it started chewing through the ropes. When his bonds fell to the floor, Graham looked at his small savior and recognized her at once. "Sir, I am glad to have been able to help you. Thanks you once again for saving my life and that of my babies. The blackguards who frequent this inn are a bad lot. It is best that you be away from here. Good luck on your journey, and don't forget to take the rope with you. It might come in handy." With that, the rat disappeared into a tiny hole in the cellar wall. The rat's advice concerning the rope made sense, so Graham picked it up off the floor. A close inspection showed that a goodly length still remained intact, despite the rodent's gnawing. A search of the cellar, however, turned up nothing that might be useful in the trek ahead. It also showed that the lone exit from the place was a locked door. When the ruffians had tossed Graham in the inn cellar, they had deposited his traveling bag along with him. It's most likely that they had no fear of Graham escaping his bonds, and they intended to return soon to finish their dirty business. This mistake turned out to be their undoing. Graham took the small hammer which the shoemaker had given him, and quietly as he could, used it to break through the door's latch. Immediately he pushed through to another room, which turned out to be the inn's small kitchen. Through the doorway on his right, Graham could hear drunken noises coming from the inn's public room. To his left, the second door led to outside, an escape. Against the far wall was a tall pantry, which the king searched before leaving. To his delight, it held a large joint of mutton, still warm and waiting to be sold. Scant payment for my most courteous treatment, Graham mused silently, but it will do. Silently removing his supper from its shelf, Graham slipped through the door and leading out. Loitering not at all, lest the hooligans note his escape, he silently motioned Cedric, who was sunning himself off a tree branch, to follow. They didn't stop until they arrived at the foot of the trail that led into the great mountains. There they rested, sure that they had not been followed. And thus it was that King Graham and Cedric prepared to leave Serenia and begin the most perilous parts of their adventure together. Part the 6th. The road to Mordack would snake itself into and through the great mountains and beyond. At the far end, the great cobra dragons were waiting to blast any who made it as far as the Wizard's Island. Those stone snakes were unknown to Graham as he and Cedric began moving up out of Serenia. He was, however, most acutely aware of the live serpent that blocked his steps at the start of the road trip. The venom dripping from its fangs, and the alert way with which it held its head aloft, informed the king that this was a creature to be avoided. The trouble was, it had coiled itself in a part of the path bordered by high rock formations. Getting around them and the snake looked difficult. Owls hunt snakes, isn't that true, Cedric? Graham asked of his companion. Why don't you just fly over there and scare it away? Hoo-hoo, me? Protested the bird. I don't care for snake. You take care of it. Don't you have a flute you can play to charm it? Graham shook his head in disgust. No flute, Cedric. But I do have this harp. Graham began playing for the creature, hoping its music, like that of a flute, might charm the creature. Graham, as always, played beautifully. The snake was not charmed. Graham next tried shaking the gypsy tambourine he was also carrying. Walking closer to the serpent, he began making a loud rattle, shaking and banging it like a mad dancer. Whether it was the king's gyrations or the noise, it didn't matter. The snake fled, leaving a clear, steep path beyond. Thanks for all your help, Graham told Cedric without rancor. Maybe I can return the favor and rescue you someday. For hours the two climbed upward, and the landscape changed from warm, green, fertile forest to snow and ice-covered rocks. Graham's footing became more treacherous by the minute, and the air turned more and more frigid. The cold and exertion both exploded as hunger in his belly and sent uncontrollable shivers through his body. I think it's time to stop for a bit, Graham breathed through chattering teeth. Get that heavy cloak on me and some of the mutton into me. He did just that. The long, fur-lined cloak cut the chill wind and began to bring warmth to his cold arms. The high collar gave welcome relief to the back of his neck. The meat reminded him that he had not eaten in almost 2 days. The king, though, ate but half of the joint, saving the rest for another meal. Cedric didn't eat any of the proffered food, but sat on a snowy rock, wiping frost from his monocle and shivering slightly. Refreshed, they resumed their journey upward, stopping only when they came to a place where the path had been washed away by a waterfall. There seemed no way past this frozen obstacle. Any ideas? Prompted Cedric. There's the limb of an old tree up above us, the owl replied. It's easy for me to reach, but you'd need to catch your rope to it and climb. Graham looked to where Cedric was pointing. The idea seemed a good one, and he was sure he had enough rope to reach the limb. He was not sure, though, if the dead branch would support his weight. It would be a long, cold, fatal fall for the king, if that happened. As he was surveying his chances, Graham spotted a long rock jutting out of the cliff, a little distance away from the tree. "That rock looks stronger, Cedric. I think I'll try going up that way. Wish me good fortune." Taking the rope from his bag, Graham made a loop and tried tossing it around his target. After a number of tries, the loop caught. Graham pulled it tight, tugged twice, and began pulling himself up hand over hand. Cedric flapped up ahead of him. The successful climb brought them to a higher, icy path. This one also had been washed out by the waterfall, but the break in the trail was not as great as it was on the one below. Nonetheless, it was still too wide for Graham to jump. The frozen cascade, however, flowed around a number of small rocky outcroppings, which looked much like stepping stones across the chasm. Beyond those steps, a fallen log made a bridge across the rest of the way. To venture farther on his quest, he had to go across. "What do you think?" Graham asked the bird. "Will they support my weight?" "They told me, but I'm an owl," replied Cedric. "Even then, I'd fly across anyway." "The three on top look the most stable. Try those. After that, maybe the one nearest the log, and then over. Try not to slip. If you fall, I'll have no one to talk to all the way back to Crispin's." The king shrugged and carefully began following Cedric's proposed route. Since before he became king, Graham has been renowned for his speed and agility, as does all folk. The ensuing years have robbed him of some of both, but it has left him enough to make it across the frozen slide that day. Graham told me that he slipped twice, nearly losing both his footing and balance. By the time he alighted on the small ledge to where the rocks led, the narrow log spanning the remaining gap looked wide and secure enough to pass a blinded army of drunken pachyderms. I suspect Graham exaggerates a bit, but he did traverse that snow-covered bridge without incident. Cedric beat his wings together at the conclusion of that crossing, although Graham never found out if it were for applause or for warmth. The reason for this ignorance is simple. After alighting from the slippery log, Graham and Cedric kept moving. Before the king had any opportunity to speak with his companion, the mountain's stillness was violated by the sound of the owl's screams. As if from nowhere, as silent as a midnight snow, a pack of dire wolves rushed the two, knocking Graham to the ground and snatching Cedric from the air. The wolf pack never stopped in their coursing attack, continuing headlong down an icy slope and into the distance. Graham picked himself up and followed as quickly as he could, alternating racing and sliding as he gave pursuit. He soon had to stop short, as the large paw prints he was tracking disappeared across a narrow, shallow ice bridge. The king knew just by looking that the slight span would not hold his weight long enough for him to survive crossing. But it took just a few moments of looking back and forth between where he was, where he had been, and where he wanted to go, for the king to realize that the chase was not over. Graham retraced his steps and scrambled back up the slope to where they had been ambushed. The toymaker's sled had been abandoned there in the confusion, and it was just what the king was looking for. Running as fast as he could in the hard snow, Graham pointed the sled's nose downhill, jumped on board, and with a strong push, propelled himself down the slope, directly at the fragile bridge. "Cedric, I'm coming!" he screamed, hoping that the bird might hear his shout and take heart from it. Faster, yet faster, the little sled sped. By the time Graham reached the chasm, he was hurtling at such a speed that the sled lifted out of the snow and flew across to the other side. The snow on the other side cushioned Graham's hard meeting with the ground, but it wasn't enough to save the sled. That was smashed into a dozen fragments. Dazed only slightly by the impact, Graham hurried on in the direction he had last seen the wolves. In fewer than a dozen strong strides, the king dashed around a sharp bend in the path to be confronted by the sight of a mighty palace in the distance. Clad in snow and ice, the structure stood on the highest pinnacle in the mountains. The trail he had been following led directly to it, and that was where he must go to rescue Cedric. Graham stopped a moment to collect both his thoughts and his wind. As he did both, he noticed an eagle perched on a rock at the edge of the trail. Thin and shivering, the bird appeared to be starving. "I am very hungry, traveler, but have not the strength to fly any longer. Can you spare food for me?" No longer surprised at his conversations with animals, Graham, as is his gentle nature, hesitated not at all. Taking the remainder of the mutton from his bag, he placed it in the poor bird's claws, and watched as it consumed its meal. "Thank you, traveler," it said after finishing. "Your kindness and compassion are great, and you have saved my life. May you have a safe journey." Reaching out with its great wings, the eagle soared into the distance. The king, now more rested and composed, started toward the ice palace. He had not gone far before the wolves arrived. They snarled and growled and bared their fangs at him as they raced out of a tunnel that led into the mountain. The saliva from their jaws steamed in the cold air as they took hold of Graham's cloak and began pulling him back the way they had come. The hatred in their red eyes made it look as if the wolves would rather have had their jaws pulling at the king's throat. Graham ceased struggling and let himself be led inside. After a labyrinth course through the lower tunnels and corridors of the palace, Graham was finally brought in front of the Ice Queen. Icebella is her name, and her realms stretch across the highest peaks of the highest mountains, and encompass all of the world's polar regions. So private a monarch is she, that the tales told of her have, until now, been considered fables and fanfications. Graham had heard of Icebella and her army of wolves, but had not given the stories about her much credence. The queen's audience chamber was vast and cold, with her throne carved from a single block of clear blue ice. It sits high above the room's floor, and is reached only by climbing a steep set of 30 steps, they too carved out of the same blue ice. Long, sharp rays of rock grow from the apex of this staircase, framing the queen in a granite star. Next to the stairs was a granite ice cage, with Cedric imprisoned inside. "Cedric, you're alive!" exclaimed Graham. "Kneel!" interrupted the imperious queen. Graham did. "You are invaders, and have entered my realms without permission. You must die. Take them away, my wolves, and kill them." Growling deeply, the great gray beasts moved toward the king. "Graham, do something quickly!" screeched the now vocal bird. "Remember your family!" The king says it took no prodding from Cedric to move him to action. He had no weapons, and knew words would do no good with either the wolves or the queen. He says that he hoped to distract or placate the beasts when he began playing his harp. I, for one, find the action quite illogical, especially given the circumstance, but the king maintains that it was the only idea he could come up with at the time. "Music has much magic," he said. "Anyway, if it didn't work, I was going to use the instrument as a club." No sooner had the first surprising notes left the strings than Icebella called off her wolves. "Your music softens my heart." "Somewhat," she announced. "Therefore, I will give you and your cowardly bird a chance at life. There is a Yeti who lives nearby in a crystal cave that belongs to me. Defeat the beast, and you will be allowed to leave these lands alive. If you fail, the owl will follow you in death. Sir Grey Wolf will lead you to the cave. Do you accept?" "Your wish is my command," was Graham's foregone reply. At the time of the year that these events occurred, there is not much darkness at night in the northern reaches of our world. Thus, while the moon was full and high in the sky, there was much light for Graham to see by, as Sir Grey Wolf led him over the narrow mountain paths that took him to near the Yeti's cave. "I will wait for you here," he warned. "If you try to escape without vanquishing the Yeti, I will kill you. If you succeed, I will return you to my mistress. And if you don't start going to the cave now, I'll rip your throat out." Since you put it that way," Graham replied, and set his steps toward the large opening he could see in the near distance. Graham still had no idea as to how one went about defeating a Yeti. His son Alexander had met one once, but had been able to avoid it through the use of magic. Graham had neither magic nor ideas. As a result, he decided to stop and think further on the matter, and perhaps munch on a bit of pie to help stimulate his thinking. "I might as well meet the beast on a contented stomach," he reasoned. Now the Yeti is a huge and fearsome creature, human-shaped but several times larger, covered with coarse and pungent fur, and overly equipped with long claws and fangs. It is said that their intellectual capacity is nil, but no one I have ever heard of has survived initiating a conversation with a Yeti. Graham saw no sight of the beast as he neared its cave, so he picked his stopping place close to the entrance so that he could keep watch while he ate. On the trail behind him waited the wolf, and ahead the path twisted behind a large boulder. A vast precipice plunged down beside the trail to his right, and the cave was to his left. The custard pie, of course, had not traveled well. It still had its oval shape, but it was greatly dented and smeared. Even to Graham, whose sweet tooth never saw a pie it didn't like, found it unappetizing. It was at this moment, as the king was staring disappointedly at the custard pie, that the snow monster arrived on the scene. It had the courtesy, at least, to announce its arrival with a killer roar, and that is what it saved the king's life. What would you do, dear reader, if confronted that quickly by such a monster while stupidly looking at a pie instead of just looking out for danger? What Graham did was totally reflexive. Startled, he jumped at the roar and flung what was in his hand in the direction of the attack. The king's aim is good. It always has been. The custard pie splatted squarely in the Yeti's face. The creature literally never knew what hit it, and with vision totally obscured by the gooey filling, it stepped off the cliff's edge. The beast may be falling still. So quickly had it all happened that it took the king a few moments to realize that he had beaten the monster. "Did I really do that?" he asked the heavens. Shaking his head in befuddlement, he entered the Yeti's lair to make sure there was no other beast about. The interior of the Yeti's cave was a multicolored crystal fairyland, with nothing else inside but the flashing sparkles of reflected light. One particularly brilliant crystal near the cave's center caught Graham's eye, and he liked it so much that he decided to carry it with him. The little cobbler's hammer made easy work of breaking it loose. The king then turned his steps back outside and down the trail to the waiting wolf. Together, they returned to the Ice Queen. Part the 7th. Queen Icebella's demeanor was much warmer toward Graham and Cedric after the king informed her of the death of the Yeti. Indeed, she revealed to Graham that she knew who he was, and wished him good fortune in his quest. She too had little love for Mordak. With a slight motion of her hand, Cedric's bars disappeared, and the owl and the king were finally reunited. After another broader gesture, Sir Grey Wolf led the two out of the palace, and through the snow to a spot where a trail out of the mountains began. He silently stood watching as Graham began his long trek down to the distant sea. A silent Cedric flew along a little ahead, watchful for danger. As it happened, Cedric's vigilance wasn't enough. The path did not go smoothly down. At times it rose up steeply before it resumed its course to the lower altitudes. It was at the top of one such climb that the owl's frantic screech of "Graham! Danger!" came too late to help the king. Cedric's words were still in his beak when the loud thumping of enormous wings and the impact of beaten air cast Graham to the ground. A set of strong yellow talons grabbed hold of him, and in moments Graham was soaring high in the cloudless sky, staring into the beaks and eyes of a giant rock. The suddenness of the attack stunned Graham. 1 second he was on his feet, and the next he was dangling so far above the peaks that they seemed no larger than toys. As the king glanced down at the cliffs far below, and his captor's 2 heads inches above, Graham realized that he was caught between a rock and a very hard place. The thought did not amuse him, and he prayed the rock would not drop him. It didn't. In fact, the 2-headed monster bird placed Graham most gently down and then flew off. Down was the rock's nest, and it had been built on the tip of a tall rock spire, which soared up to the very clouds. However, that there was no way down other than to fall. That there was no way down other than to fall was a fact of little immediate concern to the king. The more urgent problem was that Graham was sharing the nest with a giant egg, the shell of which was beginning to crack from the inside. There was no place to run, no place to hide, and a baby rock, a hungry baby rock, was about to join the king in the array. Graham knew that if he could fly, he could escape. But of course, he could do neither. Therefore, all he could do was attempt to bury himself beneath the twigs and branches that made up the large nest and hope the baby or its mother wouldn't notice him. He had little hope that it would work. As Graham tried to conceal himself, a bright glint in the nest caught his attention. He grabbed for it as if reaching for life itself. As his hand closed on the object and then opened, he had but a moment to notice that it was a delicate golden locket that he had obtained. How it had come to be there was of no import to Graham. Birds often pick up bright bits to add to their nests. Graham was more concerned with the shrieking that was approaching the nest, and his quick glance showed that it was coming from a speeding eagle. Thus again, King Graham's kindness to a creature in need repaid him beyond measure, for it was the same bird whom he had fed on the icy trail coming to his rescue. Its arrival could not have been more timely. The rock had finally broken its heads out of the egg and was hungrily pecking at the king. The brave eagle swooped low, and for the second time within moments, Graham was airborne in the clutches of a bird. So close had he come to being bird food that his cape remained in the baby rock's beaks. "I was hoping to repay you, traveler," the bird screeched above the wind. "When I saw you taken by the rock, I knew I must fly fast to your aid. May the rest of your journey be safer than what you just endured. Farewell." As it spoke, the eagle carried Graham lower and lower toward a sandy beach far below and in the distance. Its farewell was uttered as it dropped the king the final few inches to the ground. Upward it winged, catching an upwind and soaring inland, dipping a wing once in salute. Graham waved his own farewell in reply. "You most certainly have interesting ways of getting around." From atop some small rocks, Cedric's husky voice greeted Graham. "What happened? I was afraid the rock had killed you." Graham explained what had happened to the incredulous owl. "If I meet more birds on this quest," he finished, "I think I may grow feathers of my own." Cedric hooted in laughter. Graham found that the beach they were on was not very extensive. A short way to the north, a waterfall tumbled down cliffs to the sea. A small boat was beached near it. Those same cliffs extended south past Graham and prevented him from climbing back into the mountains. As his eyes followed the cliffs south, the king saw a small hut with a thin stream of smoke wafting out of its chimney. "We've reached the ocean, Cedric," Graham explained, somewhat needlessly. "If you're correct, then Mordak's island lies across these waves to the east. Let's see if the person in yonder hut knows anything about the island. Perhaps we'll be able to borrow a boat." Setting his steps down on the beach, the king started for the hut, stopping only briefly to pick up a rusty iron bar he found laying in the sand. "Who? Hoot?" queried Cedric. "Daddy's advice," answered Graham. The hut had been built in the shape of the bow of a ship, and a ship's bell hung next to its door. After clanging the bell loudly many times, the door was finally opened by an old man, an ancient mariner so deaf that his entire vocabulary seemed to comprise of, "What'd you say?" and "Speak louder, I can't hear you." There was obviously no help to be obtained from him, so Graham and Cedric left. They trudged back up the sand to examine the boat Graham had noticed. Close examination of the small craft showed why it had been abandoned. The small sail, though serviceable, was quite tattered and would not survive a hard wind. The boat's hull was in need of much scraping and several coats of paint. Graham even found a small hole in the boat's bottom. However, both Graham and Cedric could see faint outlines of small islands to the north and east, and any one of them might be Mordak's. After traveling so far, Graham was not about to be stopped with his goal within sight. The king had been carrying with him the wax from which he had squeezed honey in the dark forest. It had occurred to Graham that he could use the substance to firmly plug the hole in the boat. True, the patch would not last long, but it should be enough to sail to the islands and back. Rocking the craft so as to get access to the lake, to the hole, Graham pushed the wax into place and made a tight seal. "That should do for a while," he told Cedric. "If it doesn't, you can always fly back to shore." "Aye, aye, Captain," saluted Cedric. "When did you ever learn to sail?" Who, me?" the king replied. With a great heave, he pushed the boat into the ocean and hopped aboard. Cedric followed after. King Graham decided that his best course across the ocean was one which could bring them back easily, as opposed to one that might get them lost. Therefore, he first maneuvered just a bit south and dead center of the strip of beach. He then pointed his craft east and leaned back to enjoy the ride. "Leave due east, return due west," Graham told Cedric. "Even a bird like you would have a tough time getting lost this way." And so they sailed for several hours, staying away from the occasional shoals and rocks they spotted. Graham planned to explore the first island they came to, and if Mordak wasn't there, go on to another. Eventually, they were sure to stumble on the Wizard's Island. Things did not quite work out that way. The first island they came to looked tall and green and lush in the distance. A small sheltered beach gave the impression that it would survive a safe horror. "Land ho-ho!" shouted Cedric, and Graham sailed for shore. Just as the boat grounded itself, horrible screeching cries pierced out of the sky. "Not again," despaired the king. Diving out of the sun came 3 hideous winged forms, part woman, part flying daemon. The harpies screamed right down on Graham and Cedric, snatching them out of the boat and into the sky. They then separated, bearing the king and Cedric in different directions. Graham fought to escape the pair that were bearing him, but their clutches were too strong. The harpies finally dropped the king with a hard thud in the center of a high clearing near the island's top. When Graham recovered, Cedric was nowhere to be found, and he was surrounded by a score of the monsters. They were fighting over their dinner, and that meal was going to be the King of Daventry. It is said that to compare the voices of harpies to chalk scratching slate is unfair to the chalk. Graham concurs. He told me that their shrieking contracted the muscles of his back and shivered his spine. It was so bad that he had been playing his harp, the same as he had done for Queen Icebella and her wolves, if only to cover up their voices. They are named harpies after all, he told me. At once, the hideous hags stopped fighting over Graham and began fighting over Graham's harp. One particularly large harpy suddenly flashed down and snatched the instrument from his hands and then flew away. This so outraged the others that they began screaming as one and began to give chase to the monster with the harp. All disappeared, flying into the north, screaming to scare the dead as they went. As soon as Graham's knees stopped shaking and his ears ceased being outraged, he began searching to discover what had happened to his companion. As he picked himself off of the ground, he jabbed his palm on something sharp. When he looked to see what it was, he discovered an old fish hook. It was rusty, but its bite had not gone deep nor drawn blood. He put it in a pocket and started walking downhill on a broad path. He at last found Cedric. The owl lay crumpled in the sand by the path, barely breathing. When Graham tried to speak with him, all Cedric could do was moan weakly. Without aid soon, the bird would quickly die. Graham picked Cedric up, praying that his effort would do no further damage to his friend, and hurried the rest of the way to the beach. The boat was still safely there, the waves lapping at it gently. A large seashell stuck out of the sand by its side. A conch shell! The discovery brightened the king much. Ofttimes, folk use such shells to help the partially deaf hear. Graham could take Cedric back to the mainland, and perhaps the old man might be able to help him. It was the owl's only chance. Graham took the conch, put Cedric into the boat, pushed off, and sailed back the way he had come. His scheme of taking the straight and direct route had borne its fruit, and the boat sailed directly up to the beach in front of the old man's hut. Graham rang the bell again, and eventually the ancient mariner responded. "Eh? Can't hear you. Speak up, sonny!" Graham handed the shell to the man, who looked at it and smiled. Holding it to his ear, he waited for Graham to speak again. "Can you help us? My friend, Cedric an owl. He has been seriously wounded by some harpies. He needs healing." "Harpies? Oh, why didn't you say so sooner? Come on in, I'll help anyone who's been hurt by those foul beasts." Inside, Graham laid Cedric on the mariner's bed. The old man boiled some water and placed some poultices on the injured bird. Next, he fed him some herb tea. "That should fix him," the man said finally. "Make him good as new, maybe better." On the bed, Cedric was already showing encouraging signs of vigor and alertness. "Sir, my name is Graham, and the wizard Mordak has kidnapped my family. Cedric and I were trying to reach his island when we were attacked. Do you know where it is? Can you help us?" "Well, sonny, I wouldn't want to deal with that mad Mordak myself, but can't stand in your way from trying to help your loved ones. Tell you what I'll do. Your friend there should be ready to travel in a few minutes. In the meantime, I'll whistle up a friend of mine. She'll be able to take you to Mordak's island, but no further. What do you say? Is thank you enough?" "That'll be fine, sonny. That'll be just fine." The old man's friend was a mermaid named Pearl. Mermaids are not the most talkative of folk, and this one was even less so. She quietly listened as the man asked her to show Graham and Cedric the way to Mordak's. She nodded her assent and waved for Graham and Cedric to get into the boat and follow her lead. In the brief time that it took Pearl to arrive, Cedric's strength and good humor had returned. Graham held the bird, gently scratching its head, while the old man had asked the mermaid for help. "Thank you, sir. I don't know how Cedric and I can ever repay you." The king and Cedric got into the boat and waved farewell to the ancient mariner. "May your quest be successful, King Graham. May you and your family survive this adventure safely. If you do, that'll be reward enough for me. Fare ye well." Graham pushed the small boat into the waves for the last time and sailed off following the mermaid. His eyes glued themselves to the far horizon, searching for Mordack, and hoping he was not too late to save Valanice, Alexander, and Rosella. Part the last. Mordack's island loomed like a dark storm cloud on the edge of existence. No natural storm, though, was this thoroughly black and evil. The island appeared as if it had been melted into creation, with black and purple and inorganic green drippings, giving the landscape a soft and repulsive approach. Mordack's island may actually have been floating above the waves. Most surely the bulk of it hung suspended above the ocean. Graham thinks that the chances are good that those parts that did seem to touch the water were illusion. The only exception was one tiny rocky beach that was guarded by a pair of ominous stone pillars and sea creatures of the more repulsive and dangerous kind. Pearl waved goodbye to Graham and Cedric while the island was still a fair distance away. Her face had turned gray and her eyes had filled with fright. It was quite apparent to Graham that she had used all of her courage in order to take them as close as she did. He begrudged her nothing as she sped away, and prayed she had not brought them too far before she fled. The Sea Guardians did not get to Graham and Cedric's craft. The rocks and surf did. 20 feet or so from shore, the boat was capsized and crushed. Graham, Cedric, and the pieces washed up on the small beach. All lay still for several minutes until Graham was able to stagger to his feet and cough the seawater from his lungs. As he did, he heard Cedric call for help and was able to pull him from beneath the wreckage of their former craft. They were now on Mordack's island and had no way off. If they failed, they wouldn't need one. Graham took stock in their surroundings. A crude set of rock stairs had been carved out of the island's weird stone, and dared the two to follow them up. "Graham, I don't like this place at all," whispered Cedric. "Neither do I, Cedric, but my family's here. I must go on." Graham looked around some more. Stuck between two rocks was a dead fish. In many ways, Graham's adventure had started with the smelly fish he had found in Serenia, and it had proven useful. This was much fresher. Graham took it anyway, both as omen and for good luck. "Not another dead fish," Cedric complained. "Just keep looking out for rocks," was the king's rejoinder. They faced the stairs, and Graham began climbing. Cedric followed at a safe distance. The cobra dragons were waiting for them at the top of the stairs. Massive carven stone statues they were, with great gems for eyes. As Graham and Cedric approached them, the eyes began to glow with an incandescent light that seemed to follow the king's every step. They flanked both sides of the narrow path that passed between them and led to a lightless, lifeless castle beyond. The castle had the same burned, melted look as the island itself. Graham knew that they must pass the Stone Guardians in order to reach Mordack's castle. Cedric had no ideas as to what approach to take, except to point out a series of scorched gashes in the ground at the point where the cobra dragons looked at the path. "There is danger here, Graham," the owl observed. "I don't like the look of those statues." The king could not agree with Cedric more, and inched closer to the watchers to get a better look. The eyes grew yet hotter and brighter, and they gave the king an idea. As a student at the Royal University, Graham had often experimented with crystals. He had learned of crystals' curious property of not just breaking up and diffracting light, but the less-known one of redirecting rays. Making light bend and turn cartwheels back on itself is the way one of his learned teachers had described the natural phenomenon. Graham remembered his lessons well, and had a crystal with which to duplicate those old experiments. "If I'm wrong," he told Cedric, "remind me not to try this again." Holding the crystal that he had taken from the Yeti's cave high above his head, he walked still closer to the statues. The eyes now pulsed with even greater light and energy, and together, with dual flashes, both guardians shot bolts of flaming lightning at the king. They struck the crystal at the same time, as if attracted to it. The crystal seemed to absorb the deadly energies, glowed momentarily with an energy of its own, and shot the rays back at the statues. The cobra's eyes exploded and died. The crystal shattered, destroyed also by the act. The smoke thinned, and Graham and Cedric were free to approach Mordak's castle. The path to Mordax soon turned from dirt to solid stone blocks. Those blocks then changed to air, abruptly ending at a chasm which protected the great carved main door from intruders. A small stone stairway, though, led down away from the walkway and meandered into the distance around the lower side of the keep. Since it was the only way forward, Graham took it. The second stone path took Graham around the side of the very base of the keep. It ended on a great stone platform, which also dropped off into a deep crevice. Beyond this point, there was no going forward. In the platform, though, was embedded an iron gate. Graham knelt and attempted to peer down into its depths, but could see nothing but darkness. He tried lifting it, pulling and tugging with all of his strength, but it was rusted tight. The king was unable to budge it. "Time to go back," announced Cedric. "There's nothing left to do here." "I'll think of something," responded the king. He took the iron bar from out of his traveling bag and began using it for leverage as he began to pry at the gate. "Sure I can get into the castle through here," he said. Finally, his efforts were rewarded, and the heavy iron bars began to move a little and then lift. Once the rust had been broken, the king was able to lift the grate enough to use his iron bar as a prop. The way into Mordak's castle was open. "I'm going in," announced Graham. "Are you coming?" "Owls are outdoor birds," Cedric replied. "We don't like it indoors. Anyway, I think it's too dangerous. I'm staying out here to keep watch." "It's a good idea, Cedric, but I'm going down anyway. Wish me luck." "May good fortune go with you, King Graham. You're going to need it." The king climbed down through the narrow opening and into the bowels of the wizard's castle. There was some light to the king's relief. It came mostly from a grayish glow given off the walls. But some faint illumination did seem to slant down from above through slight cracks in the ceiling. The place looked like a dungeon. It had passages twisting and turning in every direction. "This might as well be a maze," Graham mused. "A person can very easily get lost in here." Looking up, he could see the opening through which he had entered the castle. It was too high to jump and reach, but it would provide a bearing if he became lost. "Pick a direction. Any direction," he commanded himself. He chose south behind him and began exploring. Graham says that he wandered that maze for hours before he discovered the door out. Most every way he went looked the same as the one before. A dozen times, if once, he returned to where he started, and in none of those instances was the return intentional. Graham started feeling that he was alone in the universe down there, with the hollow sound of his footsteps as the only music in creation. Eventually, though, he thought he could make out another sound. It did not appear to be the drip of water on stone, or even that of another's breathing. Instead, it sounded like the deep, steady rumble of a rock chanting, "Dink, Dink, dink. In a far corner of that maze, Graham finally encountered the source of that sound. It was not a rock, but a very large creature, the likes of which the king had never seen, heard of, nor read about before. Slightly taller, but broader and more massive than a human, it seemed made up from the parts of a number of beasts, especially those with massive limbs and large teeth. The most bizarre thing about Dink, which is what the king later learned it was called because of the sound it always makes, was the fact that his hair, or mane, was tied into a top knot on his head and held in place with a pin. So comical was its appearance that Graham forgot for the moment that the creature was most likely deadly. Combined with its incessant patter of dink, 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 it was enough to make the king begin to giggle. Graham says that it was the rhythm of the dink's chanting that moved him to begin playing the tambourine. He says that the beast's cadence was like the beat of a gypsy dance. But Dink did not respond when Graham banged and shaked. His eyes lit, but he just hulked there, doing nothing. "Here, you try," said Graham. When he handed the instrument to Dink, the beast jumped alive with pleasure. Imitating what the king had done, Dink banged and smashed a cacophonous rhythm, punctuated by happy leaps and clumsy attempts at dance. Graham says he was lucky he was not stomped in joy. Still shaking and booming, Dink moved away from where Graham had found him and began dancing away down a corridor and out of sight. All that was left of his presence was a lone hairpin which had fallen as a result of the revelry. Graham picked it up for reasons which have been discussed earlier. Other than the meeting with Dink, Graham encountered no others as he wandered Mordak's maze, and at last turned one final corner and found a door in, he thinks, the northern wall. As you might guess, the door was locked. "After all I've been through, no mere door is going to keep me from my family," Graham announced to the dungeon. He began pushing and pulling and tugging, but to no effect. The door was too thick for him to make any impression on with his shoulder. Finally, he examined the lock again. It was not large, and the key that would open would have to be small. With no other alternative, Graham took out Dink's hairpin and began to fiddle and pry at the mechanism. To the king's astonishment, his attempt at picking the lock worked. The small click was one of the most satisfying sounds he had ever heard in his life. So smoothly did the attempt go that Graham suspects that the pin may very well have been the lock's key. With a gentle push, the door opened. Graham went through the open door and emerged in the castle's pantry. A wide set of steps led up from the dungeon into the storage room. Rough-hewn wood shelves lined the two walls, but the king could see nothing on any of them which might help him. The pantry contained one large closed cupboard. The only item inside of it that was portable was a sack of dried peas. Why not, Graham thought. At this point, anything could come in handy. Perhaps I'll have the opportunity to push Mordak into a pot of pea soup. As the king was thinking, he heard a series of scrapping noises from the next room, which he suspected was the castle's kitchen. Graham carefully peeked a look through the archway into the kitchen, staying as tight to the shadows as he could to avoid detection. The kitchen was filthy and in disarray, and it had one large iron pot boiling over the cooking fire. It seemed that witch's stew was on the menu that night. The room appeared at first to be empty, but a second look revealed a young dark-haired girl with bleeding knees in one corner scrubbing the floor. Although she was filthy, and her clothes rags, she projected an aura of dignity and nobility. Graham was sure that she was no ordinary scullery maid, and was most likely a slave or prisoner to Mordak. Rather than try to slip past her unnoticed, Graham walked boldly out of the shadows to catch her attention. He risked raising an alarm from the girl, but suspected she might hate her master enough to help him. As Graham approached, she looked up, stifled a scream, and shrank back from the king in fear. "Leave me alone!" she cried. "Please be quiet. I won't hurt you." "You're one of Mordak's evil men! Stay away!" The girl was terrified of Graham, and with constant, quick, fearful glances up at him, went back to her work. Graham could see that he must take another approach to overcome the fear. The king had never inspected the small gold locket he had grabbed in the rock's nest. Events had carried him along too quickly for that. Nonetheless, he removed it from his bag and glanced at it briefly to make sure that it was gold. Gold it was, crafted in the shape of a small heart, shut by a tiny clasp. It was attached to a dainty golden chain. Perhaps a gift will calm her, he thought. "Here, take this. I won't hurt you. Please, I'm just trying to rescue my family." Reaching out to the scared girl, Graham offered her the locket, trying to convince her of his good intentions. As she saw it, her eyes widened with surprise and delight. "This is mine! Where did you get it? I thought I had lost it when Mordak kidnapped me." She opened the locket and showed Graham the two portraits that it contained. "These are the likenesses of my parents, the rulers of the Green Isles. My name is Princess Cassima, and Mordak kidnapped me when I refused his offer of marriage. He transported me here and set me to work scrubbing floors and cleaning chamber pots until I accepted his hand. Something I'll never do, so much do I hate him." Graham told Cassima the tale of his family. And the girl said the bottle containing them and Castle Daventry was in Mordak's laboratory on the second floor of Mordak's home. She told the king that she would help him any way that she could, and he promised to free her if he defeated Mordak. Cassima also warned Graham to beware of Mordak's monstrous blue henchman, a creature who always prowled the halls of the castle, never sleeping. "And most especially, King Graham, do not let the cat see you, not even a glance. For the cat is Mordak's brother Manannan, and I fear that you will be doomed a horrible death if he catches any sight of you." Cassima pointed to the west stone passageway that led beyond the kitchen. "Mordak's living quarters begin through there. May good fortune go with you, kind sir." "My family and I shall return for you, princess," the king promised. "I must go now. Farewell." The corridor beyond was quite different from the utilitarian decor of the kitchen and pantry. Decorated with massive statues of demonic beings and stone gargoyles whose faces turned to follow him as he walked, it also contained a hugely and bizarrely carved pipe organ. So hideous was it that Graham is sure that it played music only for the denizens of the deepest hells. He was careful not to even brush it as he passed through, touching his boots to the stone floor as noiselessly as he could. The corridor brought Graham to the castle's long dining hall, although the king winced at the thought of just who or what Mordak might invite to entertain in it. From behind, the king heard the sound of Mordak's henchmen approaching. He quickly dashed through the hall and emerged in the castle's main entry. Immense statues of winged women loomed above him here, the images of either beautiful vampires or succubi, he was sure. A set of stairs led up beyond this point. Through a stone arch loomed over by a feathered snake daemon. Mordak's sense of fine art was beginning to overwhelm Graham with horror, but he was sure he had discovered the way up to Mordak's laboratory and his family. Graham's slight pause to cringe at Mordak's statues was his undoing. From out of the dining hall burst a beast which was both part ram and part praying mantis. Its red eyes locked on the king, and in a quick bound had the king in its tight grip. Graham could not pull free as much as he fought. Then a magical door appeared in the air next to both of them. Inexorably, Mordak's guard moved to that aperture, carrying the Graham despite all the king's struggles. It stepped through. King Graham picked himself out of a foul puddle in the dirty cell where Mordak's henchmen had cast him. Soiled straw scantily littered the floor, and the bone remains of former victims hung from the damp halls, still bound in their chains. Vermin scampered all about, as if anticipating new food. Once the magic entry had disappeared, there were no doors at all. Graham was trapped and doomed. The sight of a rat vanishing through a tiny hole in the wall reminded the king of the one who had rescued him from imprisonment in Serenia. He was sure there was no chance of that happening to him again, but he nevertheless stretched out on the floor to peer after where the rodent had gone. Like the rest of Mordak's dungeon, the stones themselves gave off a slight illumination, and because of this light, the king was able to look within the rat's hole. The creature was not to be seen, but its cheese supper was. The sight made Graham hungry, but his reach was just the slightest bit too short to reach the morsel. I bet it can spear it with something like a fish hook, the king reasoned, and that's something which I happen to have. Taking the large hook from his pocket, Graham tried again and got his prize. "Yuck, it's moldy," he exclaimed once he saw what he had taken. Graham would have thrown the cheese away on the spot, except for what happened at that moment. The squealing of a huge stone block moving on poorly oiled rollers drew his attention to the far wall. There, a portion of the prison wall was moving inward, creating a passage leading out. Through it came Cassima. "Cassima, where did you come from? How did you get here?" "Through the maze, of course, King Graham. I've spent much time down here with Dink, my only friend. I discovered this secret way into the cell, and when I heard Mordak's henchmen captured you, I rushed down here to let you out. Hurry, follow me." Crawling out behind Cassima, Graham found himself once again in Mordak's maze. The girl sped ahead of him so quickly that the king was sore put to keep her in sight. By the time he reached the kitchen, she was already back at work, as if she had never left. "Good luck again, King Graham," she uttered. "Please, try and stay away from that blue meanie, because I'm sure I'll be noticed if I try to rescue you again." Graham knew that her words were wise, and realized that he had to deal with the guard in some way to avoid being captured a second time. He moved back into the castle's corridors with more vigilance, and headed for the stairs going up. Graham met the guard almost at once. It was just entering the hallway with the hideous organ as the king arrived. Again, the henchman's hooves dashed over the stone floor. This time, Graham's planning executed perfectly. The king had taken the bag of peas and was holding it at the ready. As soon as the creature started racing at him, Graham tossed the dried pellets on the floor in front of it. With its footing turned to rolling peas, the guard lost all traction and crashed its head to the stones with a hard thump. It lay there unconscious, but Graham knew that it would not be the situation for very long. He dashed off, hoping to make it up the stairs before the creature awoke. Manannan was waiting for him in the dining hall. Princess Cassima, if you recall, had warned the king about the cat. Here he was now, the same evil one who had kidnapped his son and was now threatening to eat his family. Here he was, looking at Graham with hateful blue eyes. If Graham could not silence the cat some way, his mission was doomed. "So you want to eat my family, Manannan," Graham whispered. The king took the fish he had found on the beach and tossed it across the room. Manannan might be a wizard in feline form, but he was still a cat. Unable to resist fish, the cat rushed to it and began sniffing. At once, Graham ran over to it and, using the bag that instants before had held the peas, scooped up Manannan up into it. The wizard yowled and thrashed within, but the burlap muffled its cries, and Graham was able to tie the bag securely closed. He tossed it into a corner, knowing that Manannan would be no further bother for quite a long while. Let me digress briefly. King Graham, in bagging Manannan and leaving him in Mordak's dining room, intended to return later and secure his captive. As events turned out, he and his family returned to Daventry before that could be accomplished. What became of Manannan? Did he perish there, unable to claw out of his burlap prison? Or is he at large again, freely plotting new and more terrible revenge on the royal family of Daventry? As I write this long narrative, we do not know. We hope the cat came to a final end on the castle floor, but until I or some other travels there to determine the final truth, we shall remain in ignorance. We pray that our ignorance does not return to bite us. The way to Mordak was now clear. Graham rapidly moved through the dining hall to the stairway, and most quietly and carefully ascended. No one was about at the top, and no noise came from either of the doors which Graham could see. He found that he was on a small landing, loomed over by a huge clawed skull carved out of stone. The king chose the far doorway, and paused to peer around its edge before entering. No one was within. Graham found himself in Mordak's bedroom. More of Mordak's obscene statues cluttered the room, all of them staring at the wizard's bed with lecherous leers. The king's stomach briefly turned, unwilling to imagine the acts which might take place near where he stood. At the far end of the room, a smaller portal led beyond to Mordak's library. Graham went to it, and on a large table discovered an open book of magic. At the top of each page was inscribed the legend, "The Objurgation of Souls." The pages were so smooth that they may have been made of the smoothest, thinnest ivory. Few words were inscribed there. Mostly there were ornate drawings with the names of what could only be spells next to them. The remainder of the text was in symbols that Graham could not decipher. The king says that he felt what he describes as a ripple vibrate through him as he gazed on those pictures. It was as if an energy entered and passed through him, and the drawings branded themselves into his brain. At the time, Graham attributed the feeling to fright. There was good reason for Graham to be frightened at the moment. No sooner had he taken his eyes from the grimoire than he heard a poof explode in the bedroom. Sure he had been discovered, Graham looked back and saw that Mordak had materialized in the other room. However, the wizard seemed not to notice the king, and lay down in his obscene bed. In moments, he had commenced to snore softly. I guess I must pass close past the very jaws of the wizard now, Graham thought grimly to himself. He's between me and my family. So be it. With silent steps, Graham tiptoed into the bedroom again, through a door framed by the tusks and skull of some ancient monstrosity. He affected a small black mustache. Graham took a moment to look on his unchosen enemy. He affected a small black mustache and a beard shaped like a spade. His hair came to a point, from beneath his skull cap into a widow's peak. His complexion, while not exactly black, was of a duskiness, much like feet left unwashed too long. Mordak was dressed in a long cloak with a tall collar. Next to his limp hand, on a small bed table, lay his wand of magic. Without the wand, he is powerless, thought Graham incorrectly. This made up the king's mind. On the way out of the room, he snatched it from its place near Mordak's unknowing grasp. The king moved out of the room and into the hallway, with Mordak's wand in his possession. The second doorway led into the wizard's laboratory. A large room of 2 levels filled to burstings with the apparatus of magic. An iron spiral staircase wound its way up to a balcony, where more arcane equipment awaited its master. As Graham scanned the room, his eyes found a familiar glass beaker sitting on a long table. The king could not restrain himself and rushed headlong into it. He had finally found his family and Castle Daventry. Graham says his tears flowed most freely when he at last saw Valanice and his children imprisoned in Mordak's laboratory. They looked up and saw to him, then waved and hugged and cried themselves. No sound, however, escaped from the bottle. The king reached to take the beaker and race away before Mordak returned to his workplace, but he could not move it at all. Graham's heart, which had been soaring in joy, crashed to his feet in hopeless frustration. All the king could do was search Mordak's laboratory in hope of finding some way to either free his family or escape with them. The lower level proved fruitless, so Graham sprinted up the stairs to the balcony. This place, too, offered the king little inspiration, except for one large contraption, a machine, which was burping away at the far end. Graham rushed to the thing in order to inspect it more closely. The machine had the smell of technology about it. Metal gears and levers and cogs and spokes waited to be set in motion. It was an unclean thing, bearing 2 narrow platters, one on either side, and metal rods which ran between them. At its center, near the bottom, was a pool of burbling liquid, simmering expectantly. Graham had no idea what the metallic monster's purpose might be. The platters, however, suggested to Graham that they might hold something. 2 somethings, actually, with dimensions like those of a stick. Or a wand. Magic wands! Graham exclaimed loudly. The platters are perfect size for holding magic wands! Maybe it was the fact that he still had Mordak's brightly glowing wand of magic in his hand, which gave him the inspiration. Whatever its source, the king knew that he possessed 2 of the items, and the other was dead and powerless. Could it be that this is how Mordak charges and recharges the power of his wand? If so, I can steal its power and put it in Crispin's wand. With it, perhaps I can restore my family to normal and escape this evil place. I think the king did not think that thought in such details. He had not the time. Graham placed Crispin's wand on one side of the contraption and then put Mordak's on the other. He waited, but nothing happened. Flat, he spurted. How do I make this thing work? When Casimir had rescued Graham from the dungeon cell, he had absently put the piece of old cheese into his pocket, along with the fish hook. Now he recalled it, his memory jolted by the aroma of the machine's liquid heart. Maybe odorous old cheese is what powers it, he mumbled. It most certainly smells that way, and stranger things have happened in this adventure of mine. Graham placed the moldy morsel into the bubbling brew and stepped back. Nothing happened again. Drat! I was hoping I was right. He was. Mordak's machine finally started to do something. Evidently it took some time to begin operating, a sure sign the technology was at work. But the thing slowly started to glow, and unknown powers began building, then running over and through the myriad parts. The powers then concentrated themselves on Crispin's wand, which glowed with new power. Brighter and brighter it shone, and at the same time Mordak's wand dulled. The entire process was accomplished with crackles and hisses and sharp booming crashes. When it all finished in sudden silence, Mordak's wand had blackened, and a tiny wisp of pale smoke drifted away from it. Graham paid it little heed, but went and retrieved the wand Crispin had given him. It was vibrating with fresh power. Graham was granted no time to admire the thing. From the main floor of the laboratory below, he heard the unmistakable sound of a wizard's magical arrival. It was Mordack. "What has happened here?" he intoned malevolently. Looking up, he saw Graham standing beside the strange machine. "So it's you, King Graham! Consider yourself dead!" Mordack made a wide, sweeping, melodramatic gesture in the direction of the balcony. His wand, no longer smoking, flew off from the machine and down into the wizard's hand. He never looked at it, but used it to cast a spell in Graham's direction. The king saw his ending coming. Nobody, however, saw Cedric coming. Cedric, you might ask? Cedric? Yes, indeed. Because Mordack's wand had been drained to near powerlessness in the machine. The spell it cast at Graham did not act instantaneously. Rather, it flew at the king. Cedric, who had been keeping watch on the outside of the castle, took this moment to arrive in Mordack's laboratory. "Graham, good news! Crispin's coming too!" Before his words were finished, the owl dropped to the ground lifelessly. Unaware of what was happening, he had flown between the king and the wizard's spell. "Curses!" screamed Mordack. "You have nearly destroyed my wand! You shall pay for this! Now!" With or without a wand of magic, Mordack was among the most powerful of sorcerers. With another magical gesture, he immediately transformed himself into a perverted mockery of a giant flying scorpion, although no being like it had ever existed in our world before that moment. Mordack rose into the air and flew at Graham. The king, seeing the transformation happen to his opponent, immediately recalled the pictures he had seen in the Objurgation of Souls. He somehow knew with certainty that they were spells of transformation. He recalled the tiger and wished he could become one himself so as to battle Mordack. Thus it was, and thus it became. Unknowingly, the king had memorized spells from an ancient and obscure school of magic that uses the picturing of images to cast its spells. When he wished clearly to become a tiger, he did. It was not what Mordack expected. The wizard stopped his attack in mid-flight so as to avoid Graham's tiger claws, and then fled away when the king leaped at him. And so it went with the magical battle, back and forth between the great wizard, who wielded an almost useless wand, and the great king, who defended himself with a powerful one. Next, Mordack became a dragon, a great fire drake. As that, he breathed death flames at the king. Graham wished himself into the small, quick, and darting form of a brush bunny, and eluded them all. A cobra will easily slay a rabbit, and Mordack tried this next. Graham became a mongoose, and brought the fear of physical death to the magician's hooded eyes. "You cannot slay me, puny vermin," Mordack hissed. "I shall burn my revenge into your flesh!" Mordack's roar filled the room as he transformed himself for the last time. He had become a fiery ring and surrounded Graham completely. The wizard closed the circle on the king and prepared for his kill. Valenice, Rosella, and Alexander all witnessed the titanic struggle between Graham and Mordack that day. All three knew that the king had no chance against the sorcerer, and waited in horror for Graham to be annihilated. They could do nothing to help, and realized that their end would come soon after the king's. That Graham had lasted so long against Mordack gave them a little hope, but the end, they were sure, was inevitable. From Graham's point of view, Mordak's appearance as fire was a big mistake on part of the wizard. There was one more spell which he had seen in the magic book, and Graham pictured it with glee. It did its work in 2 stages. First, Graham was returned to his own form. Second, he brought rain down upon his head, and down upon the flames that were Mordak. In a sooty puddle, the great and evil wizard Mordak was destroyed. King Graham and Daventry were avenged. Graham spent no time strutting over his victory. He went at once to the bottle where his loved ones were. He knew no spell to restore them, but pictured them clearly in his mind as standing next to him, again wearing their full forms. The magic didn't work. In despair, Graham threw Crispin's wand to the floor and wept. The patter of bare feet brought Graham out of his remorse for the moment. It was Cassima. She had watched the final battle from the shadows and had come to see if Mordak were really dead. Graham assured her that he was, but he was weeping because he had no way to help his family. It is sometimes said that when all is darkness, the faintest light will shine the brightest. It was then, when all Graham could see was despair and failure, that Crispin appeared. While the king and Cedric had battled their way to Mordak's, Crispin had learned what had happened to Graham's family. He had then embarked to set things right and battle the evil Mordak himself. He was too late for that task, but not too late for King Graham and his family. With one easy magical gesture, the king and his family were together once more, all hugging and kissing and embracing and crying and rejoicing. When they finally calmed, Graham introduced all to Cassima, who had saved his life in the dungeon. They thanked her with new hugs and kisses. Alexander was especially grateful for the pretty maiden's aid in setting them free. To the surprise of all, he begged leave to visit her on the Green Isles. She blushed and then accepted. Hugging Valanice closer, Graham had new visions of grandchildren. With another wave, Crispin magically sent Cassima on her way home. With another wave, Castle Daventry disappeared, sent back to its appointed place in Daventry. With another wave, poor forgotten Cedric was returned to health. He had not died. The spell cast at Graham had turned him to stone. A new tear came to the king's eye. So happy he was to see the owl who had become his friend. With a last wave, Graham, Valanice, Alexander, and Rosella found themselves on a hill in Daventry. Below, they could see the castle and hear the cheers of their people welcoming their return. Arm in arm, they went home. And so ends Absence Makes the Heart Grow Yonder, the 5th installment in the King's Quest series. And the novelization of maybe the most infamous of the 5 games. If you've ever seen Paul Dugan's old review in the King's Quest series, you may recall his own trepidations playing this game, so to speak. Next up, will it be the last entry for us able to read in this series? Of that I do not know. But we shall conclude Rowdy Reads in 2025 season with Air Today, Gone Tomorrow, King's Quest VI. Until next time.